Spy by Bernard Newman. Chapter 1. My story really begins 45 years ago, for if my father had never met my mother, it would never have been told at all. This sounds rather childish. What I mean is that had my father married an ordinary English girl, I would have been born an ordinary English boy, and not a cosmopolitan medley. My father at the time was on walking tour with a friend in the Black Forest a generation ago. It will be remembered the Black Forest was the favorite venue for walking tours. The Victorians were very conservative in their continental journeyings, and new trails were rare. My father and his friend had strayed slightly from the usual path, however, and had arrived at the little town of Donoshingen. To give an object to their wanderings, they had been busily engaged in trying to determine the true source of the Danube, which is officially classed as being at Donoshingen. They found the actual spot, which is suitably distinguished by a circular piece of statuary, and just at the time when they visited it, two German girls were there. One of them had a hand camera, a great novelty in those days. They were arguing as to which should hold the camera and which should be in the picture, each wanting to give the place of honor to the other. My father, who knew a little German, naturally volunteered to take the picture for them, so that both could be in it at the same time. In the country districts, Miss Grundy has never reigned quite so solidly as in towns, and it was the most natural thing in the world that my father and his friend should get into conversation with the two girls. When, after 10 minutes' talk, my father discovered that the name of both of the girls was Newman, spelt in the German fashion, of course, as Newman. It seemed too remarkable a coincidence to be missed. They had tea together in the town, and the friendship ripening apace, they were invited to dinner at the home of one of the girls. This must have been quick work, even allowing for the clean freedom of the German moral code. It appeared that the other girl was not an ordinary German at all. She was an Alsatian girl from Strasbourg, as it was then called. It has now included an O in its name, since it became French again. She was staying at Donoshingen, visiting her cousin. The little party, chaperoned by the father and mother of the local girl, talked gaily and animatedly of the charm of the Black Forest. The Alsatian cousin, however, claimed that the Vosges Mountains on the other side of the Rhine Valley were just as beautiful as anything that the Black Forest could show. Further, as they were off the beaten track and little visited by tourists, anyone traveling on foot could put up at the village inns remarkably cheaply. In fact, a holiday of several weeks would cost no more than a few pounds. She went so far as to suggest to my father and his friend that on their vacation the following year they should visit the Vosges. They did. They visited the Vosges and Strasbourg too. Their stay in Strasbourg had been intended to occupy but 2 or 3 days. sufficient to see the sights of the city. But when the end of the vacation came, my father declared that he was going to stay on a few days longer. His friend had to return to England, and was not really surprised when my father followed a fortnight later, announcing that he was going to marry the girl whose acquaintance they had first made by the source of the Danube. At this point, I ought to make a few notes about my mother, since I am told I inherit most of my outstanding features from her. She was good-looking without being particularly beautiful, intelligent without being outstandingly clever. Her outlook on life and on affairs distinguished her, however, very strongly from the equivalent English girl of her time. She was an Alsatian. She was very fond of declaring that. I can hear her now, with her emphatic tone, saying, "I am neither French nor German, I am Alsatian." When we used to argue about Alsace-Lorraine, she used to explain that it was natural that the same race should settle on both sides of a river valley. And when you look at it, that is very true. In the old days, when Europe was settling itself, the human swarm came from the east. When it arrived at the river Rhine, it did not suddenly stop, for the people who found pleasant pastures on the right bank naturally sent the good news to their friends and relations, who promptly came and settled on the left bank, or more usually pinched the land on the right bank and flung their relatives over onto the left bank to find new pastures there. So you find along the banks of the Rhine, or any other river for that matter, that you have, generally speaking, the same race of people occupying both sides of the valley. So my mother used to argue, claiming that although Alsace had been French for a couple hundred years, and although French influence had been very strong, for you must remember that during those 200 years there had been no such thing as Germany, but only a collection of miscellaneous German states. A good many Alsatian families were at least German in origin. I have already remarked that my mother had a family of cousins over in the Black Forest region. They were many times removed, of course, but the kinship had recently been cemented by an intermarriage between my mother's uncle and one of the girls from the other branch of the family. One of the principal effects of my mother's ancestry was that she spoke both French and German perfectly, and when I say perfectly, I mean it, for she was equally at home in either language. People who live in places like Alsace, I suppose, must have an aptitude for languages. For within a few months of her arrival in England, my mother was speaking English as if it were her native tongue. I don't want you to infer from the foregoing that my mother favored the German occupation of Alsace. It galled her beyond words to think that Alsace and all its people should be torn from France and passed over to Germany, just like a flock of sheep is sold in the market. Although German in origin, the hereditary instinct resulting from the effect of 200 years of lackadaisical French rule made her revolt against the petty tyranny of German local government. She was even ready to admit that German rule was far more efficient and even more beneficent than had been that of France. But nevertheless, she hated it merely because it was a rule based on force. I must also introduce my father, for some, at least, of his characteristics have been passed on to me. He was what used to be called, at that time, a gentleman farmer. He despised the term himself because he said it made him appear to be an amateur. That was the last term in the world to describe him, for he was one of the most practical and up-to-date farmers in the Midlands. For very many generations, a Newman has occupied Lodston Hall in Leicestershire. The name sounds grand. It is a corruption of Lodstone, of course, but actually the hall is nothing more than a very large farmhouse situated in the midst of several hundred acres of excellent land. My father, in fact, was one of the last men you would have expected to have taken a foreign wife, or even to have traveled abroad at all. For the latter he had to thank the influence of his friend, and as it led to his marriage, which was a very happy marriage. His friend was a welcome visitor to the end of his days. It was, therefore, into a somewhat unusual family that I was born, my father a typical Englishman of the soil, one of the famous middle class which for many generations raised and kept England in a position of honor throughout the world. My mother a cosmopolitan, for she often used to say that she was a woman of no country. She welcomed my appearance in the year 1893 very heartily, not only as the fruit of a happy marriage, but as a further and indelible tie to England. In fact, after I was born, she used to say, "I have given birth to an Englishman, therefore now I am English." A sister and a brother followed me in rapid succession, which is just as it should be, for we were able to play together. We were a very happy family. The first 20 years of my life were of no outstanding interest. I held my own at school without creating any sensation. I was strong, healthy, and took part in most games, without achieving first-class success in any. It was the same when I went up to Cambridge. My degree was good, but I did not get a first. In athletics I failed to get a blue, although in the running at both cricket and soccer. In my final year it was, of course, essential to make some kind of decision. What was I to do? I had no thought of taking over my father's farm, lucrative though it was. At first my father had been rather sad at the thought, but obviously I had no aptitude for farming, whereas my younger brother was a born man of the soil, and even in our early teens it had been tacitly assumed that he would take over the farm, while I passed into some profession. Nevertheless, even my mother, of artistic temperament herself, was surprised when I announced my intention of becoming an actor. True, the profession then was not quite so honorably esteemed as it is now. I suppose at least a quarter of the entrants to the stage in these days are university men, but before the war a degreeman on the stage was a rarity. If my parents had thought back a little, however, their surprise might not have been so great. My mother was a singer, had even sung professionally, and her grandmother had been an operatic prima donna in the days of the First Empire. Further, my mother had always encouraged any dramatic instinct she found in us. One of our favorite amusements during the winter evenings was the playing of charades, in which my mother's sister and I excelled, while the histrionic efforts of my father and younger brother would not have impressed a fly. It was not just the glamour of the stage that attracted me. I believed with Chekhov that the theater is higher than universities and books or any form of art. I believed that there was nothing that could replace the stage and so strongly and surely affect the human soul. When I wanted to go on the stage, I was not thinking of provincial melodrama, of the unhand-me villain type, but of real acting. Young though I was, I had determined to make myself a master of character parts, for even in those pre-war days, there was already a tendency to forget that half the art of acting is variety, and to class actors and actresses as types, and to cast them for nothing else. My dramatic education was very thorough. I forget whether dramatic academics existed in those days, but if so, I never heard of them. I managed to get an introduction to the grand old man of the stage, Sir Frank Benson. I joined his famous company at a nominal salary, purely with the idea of learning my art. At first it seemed that the apprenticeship was unduly long. For months I played in practically the whole range of Benson's extensive repertoire. Often I played several parts on a single night, perhaps a gravedigger and 2 assorted soldiers, but as my part usually consisted of 2 lines, or sometimes no lines at all, naturally my appearances created no furor. All the time, however, I was learning, and learning a lot. I watched the older players, how they got their effects, the tricks of speech, some of which I admired and some despised. I studied particularly their makeup, at which some of them were masters, so when my turn came to be promoted to the playing of minor parts, I don't think I let the company down, and in time I had the supreme satisfaction of playing lead. True, it was only on a few occasions, when a principal happened to be taken ill, but it was what I wanted, not just a chance to show the world what I could do, but to show myself. At the end of 2 years, I was convinced that I was an actor. I left the company with regret, for my sojourn there had been very happy, and came to London determined to throw myself into the West End. All this time, and for the next few months, I was practically supported by an allowance from home, nor did my first West End engagement enable me to inform my father that I could now stand on my own feet. My first play ran for exactly a fortnight. The second was decidedly better. It ran for nearly 5 weeks, but unfortunately I had got into the hands of a rogue manager and only received 2 weeks' pay. My third effort, however, was much more successful. I had a very good part, a reasonable salary, and the play had a long run. What young actor could wish for more? My press notices were good, and I was frequently referred to as that coming young actor, Bernard Newman. When first I read the phrase, I went out immediately to buy a new hat. My play finished its successful run at the end of June 1914. I decided that I had earned a holiday. I had the promise from my present manager of a good part in a new play, which he was going to stage in September. So off I went with my brother to visit our relatives in Alsace. From there, we strayed over to the Black Forest to renew acquaintance with our cousins, many times removed, in the Baden region. We had a wonderful time, as may well be expected. We had completely lost touch with England, wandering as we did about the Black Forest valleys, then back again to the pine forest of the Vosges. It was not until I think July 29th that one of my uncles mentioned that the European situation was serious and that there was a strong possibility of war. Surprised, we got hold of newspapers and learned about the Austrian demands on Serbia. We were amazed, for the last accounts we had read were not particularly startling. Indeed, the murder of the Archduke Francis Ferdinand had occasioned surprisingly little comment. It was 2 or 3 days later that we felt an atmosphere of alarm, and when on August 1st one of my cousins received his mobilization order, we shook hands with him, wished him luck, and made a beeline to France as the nearest friendly territory, for we knew well enough, as every intelligent man must have known, that if Germany and France went to war, England must join in on France's side. The journey back to London took 2 days, for the congestion of mobilization had already begun to affect the working of the French railways. The day after our arrival in London, England declared war on Germany. I remember the next day very well. I was young, active, and healthy, and, like hundreds of thousands more of my type, was immediately anxious to get into the middle of the excitement. My only fear, in fact, again like that of thousands of others, was that the war would be over long before I could get into it, for it must be remembered that in those days Kitchener was the only man who thought of a 3 years' war. Most of us thought it would be all over in 6 weeks. I even anticipated the famous appeal for the first 100,000. I had at first thought of joining the army on the spot, but on consideration dismissed the idea. For the reason that I have stated, I had no thought of drilling monotonously in barracks while other men were fighting in France. I did not want to be one of the people to do the cheering when the heroes came home. I wanted to be one of the heroes being cheered. Maybe it was my experience as an actor that demanded a little adulation. So, on the evening of August 5th, I went round to the flat of an old Cambridge friend of mine, Willoughby Mason. I went to him because he was a man of fertile imagination, and furthermore, being now in the Foreign Office, he ought at least to know something. I found him of the same mind as myself, that the war would be over before we could get in it, but also, as I had hoped, not without ideas. He recalled that another Cambridge man of our acquaintance had sat with him for that stiffest examination in the world, the first division of the civil service, an examination which I myself had completely funked, and had on appointment gone to the War Office. So on the spot we rang up Barclay, demanded to know what was happening, and also what method there was whereby we could join the expeditionary force, which we knew would be certain to be dispatched to France. Barclay was a great sport. He couldn't tell us anything at the time, as things were scarcely on the move. He promised to let us know as soon as he could, and he kept his word. 2 days later he rang up to say that the prospects of our going out with any line or cavalry regiment, untrained as we were for our OTC experience, was disdainfully dismissed. We were just nil, but that men of intelligence who could ride motor bicycles were urgently required as dispatch riders. That was good enough. Mason and I, who had both ridden motor bicycles for several years, immediately rushed round to Old Scotland Yard, which was the central recruiting depot. There was a huge crowd there, all clamoring for enlistment in the various arms, but after a lot of pushing and shoving, we eventually reached a recruiting sergeant, and by giving him a heavy tip were taken in to meet the recruiting officer long before our turn. In after years, both Mason and I smiled very often when we recalled that we had bribed the sergeant to allow us to join the army. Our information, however, was correct. Dispatch riders were urgently required, and a number of them would go out with the original force. The recruiting officer looked us up and down, thought for a while, and was apparently satisfied that we should meet the bill. We should have to pass tests of ability in motorcycling, of course, but these held no terrors for us whatsoever. On the morrow, therefore, we proceeded under orders to Aldershot, and the next day were duly sworn in as members of His Majesty's forces. Thus Mason and I joined the Corps of Royal Engineers, and were proud. Beyond measure of the blue and white armlet of signals which we wore around our sleeves. I need not describe our life as dispatch riders. Through the early weeks of the war, it would make an interesting story, but one of our number has already told it. It was probably the finest life of the war. There was plenty of excitement and just enough danger to whet the appetite without the hard drudgery which is the inevitable lot of the infantryman. I must mention 2 casual incidents only, which have little to do with dispatch riding, but which had a good deal to do with my subsequent career. The first was on the very day of our arrival. Our transport was alongside the dock at Havre. Everything was in a state of apparent confusion, as the horses and transport wagons of the brigade to which I was attached were being disembarked. Our brigade major was in charge of the operations, and he was greatly handicapped by the fact that his French had been learned at school and promptly forgotten. Even at this stage he might have been able to have asked for the pen of the gardener's aunt, but he was quite incapable of telling a dozen French navvies to get a bloody move on and run those blanking wagons off the quay. I came to his assistance. Probably, had I been a professional soldier, I would never have dared to have so approached a high and exalted personage like a brigade major, but he welcomed me profusely when he found that I could speak French. I had learned my French not at school, but at my mother's knee. My first phrases were not about gardeners' ants, but the little fairy stories and nursery rhymes, which should be the beginning of all childish language. As I grew up, my French, thanks to my mother's care, had developed until it was, I think I may say, in all modesty, just about as good as an Englishman's French ever can be. However, in my frequent trips abroad, I had learned a good many additional words, which my mother had never thought to teach me. They were very useful on this occasion. However, I introduced 3 or 4 of them into my first sentence, and the way those bloused Frenchmen sprang to their job, with a look of amazement in their eyes, completely captivated the brigade major. He kept me on the job for several hours, and even thanked me when it was all over. Considering that I was lance corporal, I had been given my stripe for protection purposes, only of course this was really remarkable, although I was too young a soldier to notice it at the time. The second incident was at La Ferte-sous-Jouarre. Over a fortnight later, the Battle of the Marne was in full swing. We were now advancing instead of retreating. I happened to report at brigade headquarters just as a batch of prisoners was marched into the village square, which faced the mairie which our headquarters occupied. There was my old friend, the brigade major. When he saw me, he shouted across the square, and I rode towards him. "I suppose you don't happen to speak German as well as French?" he asked. Well, of course I did, for I have already remarked that my mother considered German as her real native language. Furthermore, it is easier for an Englishman to speak really perfect German than perfect French, and I think I could claim that, as I was able to prove a few months later, my German was real German. So I asked the brigade major what it was he wanted. "I want to ask these Fritzes a lot of questions," he said rather testily, for he had naturally been tremendously overworked during the retreat. "I want to know what regiment and division they belong to, where they come from, what they were trying to do when we caught them. I want to ask them dozens of things. All I have been able to ask so far is, wo ist seinen Regiment, which I made up by myself from a dictionary. But the devil of it is that although they seem to understand my question, I can't understand their answers." This was the easiest of tasks. He gave me the question, and I asked it. I entered into my job keenly. I even tried to size up the psychology of each man I questioned. Should I ask him gently and persuasively, or try third-degree methods? Most of the prisoners, of course, refused to say anything that would have been of the slightest use, but 1 or 2 of them did, either by accident or through fear, let slip several useful details. We sorted out the information. Then I had to hurry off, for dispatches were waiting to be carried. When I left, the brigade major called out to me, "When this present stunt is over," he said, "come back and report to me. You're too useful to be careering about on a miserable motorbike." I remembered his words a few weeks later. By this time the front had become more or less stabilized from Switzerland to the sea. There were no more exciting journeys across country, never knowing at what moment you might run into an enemy patrol. Our messages were regular and unvaried. In fact, as Mason said, we had ceased to be dispatch riders and had become postmen. Obviously, if the brigade major had meant what he had said, this was the time to approach him. We did, for I insisted on dragging Mason along with me. The brigade major, after half an hour's talk, said that we must be commissioned at once. Mason would be posted to the battalion, but he would try and grab me himself for staff work. This sounded all right, and we left well pleased, while the brigade major made the necessary report. Alas, 2 days later he was severely wounded while on a visit to the support line. Nevertheless, our application for commissions went through without a hitch. The only part of his recommendation that seemed to have been overlooked was the possibility of a staff appointment for me. I was not sorry about that, knocking about different headquarters as I had done as a dispatch writer. I had seen some of these alleged staff appointments, and had noticed how officers, some of them intelligent and some of them dumbheads, but all drawing good pay and wearing brilliant red tabs, appeared to be used as little more than clerks. Some of them were not even good clerks. So I was relieved rather than otherwise when I was informed that Mason and I were to be commissioned right away and posted to an infantry battalion. After all, how could I hope to do staff work unless I were thoroughly acquainted with the duties of a regimental officer? We had only 2 days' warning. Second lieutenants were very badly needed, for it must be remembered that the little British Army had lost practically the whole of its executive officers in the retreat from Mons, the battles of the Marne and the Aisne, and particularly at Ypres. We had both served in the OTC for a while, of course, but had never taken the training very seriously. Now we sat down to think it out. We had forgotten the greater part of the drill, which we ought to have known. We did the best we could in 24 hours. However, first we found an infantry sergeant major whose battalion was out at rest, gave him 10 francs, and asked him to give us instruction in words of command. Then Mason and I went into a field, a long way from anywhere, I need hardly say, and drilled one another. It must have been indescribably comic to hear one man shout to another man, "Form fours," and to see the second man doing it. As a final training effort, we selected a couple of haystacks, stuck up impromptu targets, and put in some rifle practice. Mason and I set off to join our battalion in great spirits. 24 hours later, there were no more depressed second lutes in the whole of France. I will not mention the name of the battalion we joined, for most of its officers died a gallant death at Neuve Chapelle. When we joined it, we understood that officers were urgently required. The battalion had suffered heavy casualties at Ypres. We visualized a welcome with open arms. Instead, we got the biggest snubbing of our lives. As we entered the orderly room, the adjutant looked us up and down like a lady inspecting a particularly cheap and nasty fur coat. In the mess, we were ostracized. We were intruders, mere temporary gentlemen, scarcely fit to mingle with the elite. Mason, whose family was as good as any of theirs, and who had certainly more brains than the lot of them put together, fumed with rage, and only his training intact as a junior diplomat prevented him from showing it. I don't want you to think that all battalion officers were snobs. They weren't, but many young officers eager to help knew what it was like to have enthusiasm squashed in a night, to be treated like blacklegs who have somehow got inside a trade union. One of them has written up his experiences far more forcibly than ever I could, so I will say no more than that the following 6 weeks were the most miserable of my life, a continuous succession of snobbish insults and innuendos. This, I should emphasize, was in 1914. Later, relations were not nearly so strained. At the time, my hate of my fellow officers was far more venomous than my feelings toward the Germans. I have forgotten it now, for I saw some of them die. The pre-war regular officer may not have been over-endowed with brains, but no one would ever deny him a great courage. Few, even of the millions who later served in France, can visualize the miseries of that 1914 winter. No preparation, of course, had been made for trench warfare, and our appliances were pitifully inadequate. The trenches were haphazard ditches, often running deep in slime. I hated the filth of it all far more than the danger. After all, during the retreat, our fighting had at least been clean. Now, if a man fell wounded, he might drown in the liquid mud. The parapets of the trenches had been constructed of the nearest available materials, sometimes the dead bodies of our comrades, the smell of the putrefying corpses, the rats feasting on what once had been men, the shock when I leaned on the parapet to find my elbows sinking deeply into a hideous mass of decomposed flesh. This sort of thing made my stomach heave. I wanted to protest. This was not the war I had visualized. Where was the excitement, the thrill, to be cooped up in a muddy ditch, while guns pounded at you from 3 miles away? Was this the romance that had made men soldiers through the ages? I could have stood it better had I felt among friends. But apart from old Mason, I had none. There were some rattling good men in the ranks. My platoon sergeant commanded a battalion before the end of the war, but authority frowned heavily on the slightest association. The precious discipline might be impaired, and I can still see the stark horror on our colonel's face when he came to the front line on Christmas Day and found his battalion in no man's land, fraternizing with the enemy. I thought he was going to throw a fit. I find, by the way, that many people doubt whether the Christmas truce ever existed. It did. Of all my memories of the war, that day provides some of the most vivid. The movement seemed to spread from the south. Battalion after battalion strayed over the wire, meeting the Germans in no man's land. Usually officers went as well. Naturally, Mason and I did, for such a novelty could not be missed. I had a most interesting chat with a Bavarian officer who had been cut off on the Marne, but after hiding in the forest for a week had crawled through the French lines at night. He was very startled at my German when I spoke. At last he drew me on one side. "Anything you want me to do?" he asked. "How? Why, you are German, aren't you? Are you over there on intelligence?" It was about the best compliment to my German I had ever received. I thought it over from a very different angle some time later. He was a very decent fellow indeed. He even invited me to have a drink in his dugout, where he introduced me to some of his fellow officers. He showed me a few ideas for making trench life more like that of humans than sewer rats. His dugout interested me most. It was deep and secure, with 2 entrances. There he was safe from any bombardment. He could just pop up as the infantry came over. Later, when I had some little authority, I suggested time and time again that we ought to model our dugouts on the German pattern. I was told that deep dugouts were not good for morale. The men would feel safe there, but would refuse to come up. I argued that the Germans came up all right, as we knew only too well, and surely our men were as good as theirs. But it was useless. I suppose this decision must have cost us at least $250,000 totally unnecessary casualties. Late in the afternoon, the men began to trickle back to their trenches. I shook hands with the Bavarian, after arranging with him that there should be no fire on either side during the night. We exchanged cards and promised to look up one another after the show was over. In 1920, I did visit his home. His mother handed 2 documents to me. One was a letter dated Christmas Day, 1914, telling of his meeting with me in no man's land. The other was a telegram from the German War Department announcing his death in action on December 26, 1914. I remembered then how one of our snipers had that day claimed a German officer. Such is war. But I digress. I should have returned to my own trench. There I found a colonel with a redder face than I would have believed possible. His mustache and chin had his rage assumed incredible shapes. I have often wondered if H.M. Bateman found his original in my colonel. I was for it. It appeared that I had been the first officer of the battalion to climb out of the trench instead of shooting down the enemy on the right. I was threatened with courts-martial, hell, and eternal damnation. I was not greatly disturbed. The colonel did not seem to me to be sufficiently angelic to hold any control over the gates of hell. And as for a court-martial, well, apparently he would have to court-martial half the junior officers. of the British Expeditionary Force. However, he did manage to make it quite clear that he didn't like me a little bit. I was necessarily restricted by having to stand to attention and say "sir" at the end of each sentence, but I expect that I managed to convey the impression that I would willingly subscribe to his wreath. Mason and I condoled that night. "This is getting impossible," he said. "Something has got to happen, or I shall do something drastic. What's the penalty for punching an adjutant on the nose?" "Oh, make it the colonel," I suggested. "They can't shoot you more than once. I'd rather be mooching about on the old bike than this. To think I left the Foreign Office to take petty orders from ignorant squirts," he complained. "I might have picked up a decent job by now. Emerson's been sent to Romania to persuade or bribe her to come in, instead of dabbling in high politics, mixing with leading figures in current history. I find myself up to the knees in the mud, ordered about by men who remind me of those wriggly things you find in a really ripe gorgonzola. I'm fed to the teeth. How long, O Lord, how long?" But our deliverance was nearer than we knew, nor could we anticipate that it would come in such a manner. We came out of the line on December 28th for a tour in rest billets. We had a padre with us named Noel, one of those energetic people who are never tired and cannot appreciate that other people may be. He had a heart of gold, however, and we forgave him his energy as we hope he forgave us our language. We had been disappointed of our Christmas festivities. He argued he had missed the truce, so we would have them on New Year's Eve instead. There would be a special dinner for the men. He had bought 3 pigs. "Why bother?" Mason asked. "Why not use the colonel?" and had borrowed the local YMCA hut for a subsequent concert. I was cast for important parts. Of course I agreed. The men had little enough amusement, God knows. They had given me of their best of their trade. I would give them of my best of mine. The hut seemed to be packed with about 100 men more than it could possibly hold. In the front rows sat the officers. Even the colonel looked almost human. With them were the guests, staff officers from brigade and division, and from other units of the division. There never was a battalion which could not put up a good show. We had 1 or 2 reasonably good singers, a concertina turn, and a batman who revealed unsuspected talent as a contortionist. We had half a dozen comedians. The success of them all was a sergeant who dressed as a woman, sang one of Mary Lloyd's songs, and added extra verses which would have made Marie blush. I did some character sketches, which went down very well. In one I suggested a mannerism of the regimental sergeant majors and brought the house down. In the second half I played in a serious sketch. I rather think it was written by Noel himself. I know I had to hack it about to make it usable. I played the part of a German officer, and Mason that of an English officer taken prisoner. There were some good lines and one good situation in the piece, and I put all I knew into the playing. At the end of the show, the divisional commander sent for me and said nice things. He also recalled that he had seen me in my last show at the Royalty. I could see my stock with the colonel going up. To him, an actor was little higher than a vagabond, but if the GOC, by the side of the GOC, stood a colonel wearing the red tabs of the general staff. I didn't know him, but he beckoned to me. "The German of yours, are you really as fluent as that, or was it just swatted up from the sketch?" he asked. I could safely assure him that my fluency was natural. I explained why. "Good," he said. "Report to me at divisional headquarters tomorrow." "Very good, sir. What time?" "Oh, well, suppose we make it lunch." You may guess that Mason and I talked for a long while that night in the little one-story cottage which we shared as a billet. When I arrived at DHQ next day, I suddenly realized that I did not know who to ask for. A few tactful words to an orderly put me wise. "Oh, that would be Colonel Hilton, sir. He's GSOI. Took over from Colonel Miles when he left last month to command a brigade. He's hot stuff, is Colonel Hilton." An hour later, I agreed. Over lunch we talked of everything but the war. Then we went to his office. "Sit down, Newman," he said. "Ever thought of intelligence work?" "Often." "Ha!" He seemed surprised. "Well, that German of yours is too damned good to waste. I applied for an intelligence officer the day after I came here. I haven't got him. I may never get him. Half the divisions in France have no intelligence. It's mad. An army without intelligence is like a man without a brain." I agreed. "I've looked up your record. Your battalion commander speaks well of you." This amazed me. I had never yet heard him speak well of anyone, me least of all, but I concealed my surprise. Maybe this was the colonel's method of getting rid of me. Many an unwanted man had been cleared out of the way by promotion, and I was very impressed by your performance in that sketch last night," he continued. "I know you're an actor. You must be a damned good actor. You didn't act that German soldier. You were a German, for the time. I've got ideas I want to work out. When we take prisoners, we ask a lot of questions, but get nothing much out of them. Do you know what I'm going to do?" I hadn't the faintest idea. "I'm going to dress you in German uniform, and chuck you in the cage with the rest, as a prisoner. Are you on?" Of course I was. This was a job after my own heart, and what a man to work under. What a change from my own colonel. "Of course, you've got to get through a lot of work first," he said. "An intelligence officer needs 3 qualities. Intelligence, they haven't all got it, but I think you have. Language, you pass easily in that, and your acting makes it doubly valuable. Military knowledge, you haven't got that, so you must get busy quickly. I'll put you through a sort of staff course here. I take it you're game." Only after my eager acceptance did I think of poor old Mason. "I suppose you couldn't take 2 of us, sir," I faltered. "My friend in the battalion, Mason. His German isn't so good as mine, but it's very useful. He's a Foreign Office wallah. he could question prisoners, it would be a good idea to let him examine me in front of the rest. He could bully me. Then, when I refused to talk, it would give me caste with the others. That's an idea, he agreed, but I can't take 2 regimental officers from the same battalion. Wait till we get more reinforcements, then we'll haul 'em out. I'll write a note to your battalion now, about you. The colonel, in spite of his favorable report, was furious when I told him he didn't approve of young officers flap-doodling about at headquarters. I had no intention of flap-doodling, whatever that meant. I told him, we wanted to win the war. I wanted to help in the most effective way. There were hundreds of thousands of men with sufficient courage to stand in a muddy trench and be shot at, but not many who could speak German like a German. He said a lot of nasty things about the staff, and even phoned the brigadier. I don't know what the brigadier said to him, but the conversation closed very abruptly. So when I left the battalion the following day, no bands played. I said goodbye to my platoon and the mess, and au revoir to Mason. The colonel was missing. I can only vaguely remember now how I hated him then. Time softens memories, and I can always forgive a man of courage. He died a man's death in 1918. By that time he was commanding a brigade. He was ordered to hold his positions to the last, and he did. Whatever success I had in intelligence work, I owe it very largely to Colonel Hilton. His thoroughness was a lesson to me. I worked directly under him for some weeks, then studied the Q side of staff work. That is, the questions of supply and organization, as opposed to operations. Fortunately, I was given a chance to show my potentialities within a week of taking up my new job. One of our patrols in no man's land had surprised a German patrol, killing 3 and bringing in a wounded prisoner. Hilton and I dashed by car to the field ambulance. I shall leave this to you, he said. Work it your own way. He'll probably be one of the 38th Saxons. I particularly want to know when they are going to be relieved. Now a captured soldier is bound to tell his name, rank, and regiment, but no more. The rest is left to the interrogating officer. He may employ many methods, the friendly, the bullying, or the know-it-already. I decided on a combination of the first and last. The man was shot through the leg. His wound had already been dressed. I asked Colonel Hilton to wait outside. I borrowed a tunic from one of the RAMC officers. Then I went up to the German. As a doctor, an orderly moved the blanket, and I gravely examined the wound. "Oh, that will be all right," I pronounced. "This is the end of the war for you, but you'll be about again in a couple of months. Now let's have details so that we can report you prisoner. Name, age." I took his particulars. The atmosphere was easy, for he had been well treated since his capture. Nevertheless, it was bad luck getting a packet like this just before you were relieved. I chattered casually as I wrote down his details. Just before, he exclaimed, off his guard. More probably just after. I was on a patrol covering the relief. We should have withdrawn in another 10 minutes if your men had not run into us. Hard luck still. You are well out of it, I commiserated. Now we shall have to look to our laurels. With the Prussian Guard opposite us. No, it's only the Prussian Guard Reserve Division, he corrected, innocently enough. It's time they did some work. They've been in the line near Reims, where the trenches are clean and dry. Oh, their advance party did curse when they saw our front line. I pumped him further, but he had nothing useful to tell. He was not overburdened with intelligence. Colonel Hilton was delighted when I reported to him that the 38th Saxons had been relieved by the Prussian Guard Reserve from the Reims front. It was just what he wanted to know. "You're just made for this job," he said. "An actor and a linguist in one. What a combination for intelligence work. I've got some big schemes in view, and I shall tell the GOC how well you handled this job. It isn't every senior officer who will pass even a fraction of the credit to his junior, so I was duly grateful. Soon after this, my first success, I was officially appointed intelligence officer to the division, while still going through my staff course. From this time onwards, I was responsible for the collection and dissemination of information on our divisional front. I find in England a complete misapprehension as to the work of the average intelligence officer. I remember at the time of my appointment, that is to say, when I was definitely transferred from my own regiment to the intelligence staff, that a dear old lady, an old friend of my father's, greeted me in my new uniform, complete with green tabs, and demanded to know what I was doing. When I informed her that I was now an intelligence officer, she remarked, "Oh dear, and you have to be intelligent all the time." Well, of course, that is the one thing that is essential, though the word intelligence in the title applies somewhat differently. My work was tremendously varied, and not without its danger. I had first to keep an eye on the morale of our own troops, which I did by the rather distasteful method of reading occasional letters home, taking them at random here and there after they had passed the regimental censor. I had also to receive information from neighboring divisions, corps, and from our army headquarters. These I used to summarize every day in a daily communique, which was issued to all units in the division. My little effort at military journalism was not received with such gravity as it deserved in some quarters, for the popular name for my concoction was comic cuts. Whenever we took prisoners, of course, I was very busy, sometimes drawing a complete blank, but occasionally picking up whole volumes of information. My methods, like those of every other intelligence officer, were very varied. My stage training was a great asset. To one prisoner I was a bully, to the next a friend in whom he might confide. Very soon I learned to size up my prey, half the art of an interrogating officer. Nor did I have many scruples in going about my job. War knows no conscience, and every man does things for his country that he would never think of doing for himself. If I met a business rival today, for example, I would never think of getting him drunk so that he should tell me his secrets, but I did this on many occasions with German officer prisoners. I took advantage of the strange camaraderie which seemed to exist between the German Air Force and ours. It was quite the usual thing, if a German airman came down in our lines, that he should be entertained to dinner at the nearest Royal Flying Corps mess. I liked to attend on those occasions, because it was customary, of course, to give the visitor something to drink, and if he was not a man who could stand more than a moderate quantity of wine, he often became, under the influence of good company and good wine, more talkative than a good soldier ought to have been. One young man, in fact, inadvertently gave away in his cups the exact position of the aerodrome from which he had flown, a piece of information which we had been wanting for weeks. Needless to say, we acted on it at once, and the aerodrome was severely bombed a night or two later. Least welcome and most dangerous of my tasks was that of listening in, accompanied by a covering guard of 2 or 3 infantrymen. From time to time, perhaps once a week, I would crawl out of our front line, cross no man's land, at night of course, and get as near as I could to a German post. There would usually be 2 or 3 men on guard, and I had to listen to their conversation, from which obviously I might get a good deal of useful information. The dangers of the task are equally obvious. Sometimes I had to approach within 4 or 5 yards from the sentry post before I could hear what was being said. Had I been discovered, my covering guard would have been quite helpless. They might have got my body away, but there would have been no me left inside it. The winter of 1914-15 gave no help to men who wished to crawl about the plains of Flanders, which were now several inches deep in mud, and after I returned from one of my nocturnal expeditions, it used to take my batman 2 or 3 days to get my clothes fit for wear once more. It was not until March 1915 that I had a chance to put into operation any of those schemes which Colonel Hilton had discussed with me in our first talk, but immediately I saw the signs of battle on the horizon, I prepared for a new stunt. My chance came with what is called the Battle of Neuve Chapelle. On March 10th, after a sudden and terrific bombardment, our infantry advanced to the attack. The first stages of the battle, as often, were very successful, but later, due very largely to bad staff work, the attack broke down. It had been a success, in a way, in demonstrating the power and effect of a surprise heavy bombardment, but unfortunately the High Command only read a part of the lesson that was offered to them. They appreciated the effect of the bombardment without appreciating the effect of the surprise. Consequently, when planning subsequent offenses, they adopted long and heavy bombardments, which were no surprise at all, and so achieved practically no result whatsoever. However, we did take nearly 2,000 prisoners at Neuve-Chapelle, which gave me my chance, and as the prisoners were herded into the great barbed wire cage which had been prepared to receive them, I was flung in amongst them, for I was dressed in a German uniform, and what is more, my shoulder strap proclaimed that I belonged to a regiment only slightly distant from the scene of the battle, just to the north of Fromelis, to be exact. Thus, no question would be asked, as it would be assumed that I had been captured in the northern sector of the battle, for it was quite certain that these prisoners, captured early in the day, would have no idea as to the length of the battle front. My stratagem was very successful. At first, all of us were silent in the indignity of defeat. We were called up one by one before intelligence officers belonging to the different divisions involved. To my amusement, when it came to my turn, the task of interrogating me fell to Mason. How we kept a straight face I don't know, but I class it as one of the best pieces of acting on both our parts that we ever accomplished. After examination, the prisoners were herded back into the pen and given something to eat. After that, our spirits began to return, for a well-fed man soon forgets the horror and indignity behind him. We began to talk, comparing notes of our experiences in the battle. It was then that I began my real operations. I had joined a little group of more intelligent-looking men. Gradually I got them to talk. They had no suspicion of me whatsoever, of course, and talked quite freely, and as they thought, confidentially, of military things. I don't want to infer that they told me all the secrets of the German General Staff. That only happens in fantastic books of fiction. Naturally, they knew nothing of German staff ideas, but they did know what units were in the vicinity. They did know of back area work that was being done, and what was more important, one of them gave a hint, for he could do no more, having heard nothing further than a hint himself, that very soon the Germans had a new weapon which they were going to exploit on the Western Front. He said that poison gas was being manufactured in German factories and was to be flung in shells far behind the Allied lines, there to do terrible execution. I should say that I passed on this warning later to the Army Command, but it was practically ignored. It was not thought possible at that time to manufacture gas shells. It is interesting to note, too, that the Germans had no faith in the idea. They refused its inventor the necessary facilities for the manufacture of gas shells, so that it had to be discharged, as it was a month later at Ypres, from cylinders in the front line. That is to say, it became a very erratic and unreliable weapon. But this is by the way. Suffice it is to say that Colonel Hilton was delighted with the result of my adventure, when 3 days later I threw off my German uniform and returned to my khaki with green tabs. For the next few months my life was a varied one. Not only did I carry out my normal routine duties as an intelligence officer, but half a dozen times I went as a German among prisoners. If we had taken none, I used to go to an internment camp well behind the lines in France, where German prisoners were being used for labor purposes. It was not in such camps that I would get a great deal of information, but I was thinking of bigger things, and I wanted to make absolutely certain that my details were right. I wanted to get inside the skin of the German soldier. I knew his language, but I wanted to learn his modern slang. An educated Englishman going suddenly into the ranks of the British Army during the war might not have understood more than 2 words in 3 which he heard spoken about him. So, from these prisoners I got slang, the technical talk, and its abbreviations, and also, and this might be most important, the current and most popular swears. That my work was appreciated was shown by the fact that I was suddenly promoted to the rank of captain and placed on the intelligence staff of the First Army, which was commanded by Sir Douglas Haig, who, of course, later became Commander-in-Chief. It was while on the First Army staff that I first heard of the preparation of what was later to be known as the Battle of Loos. Immediately I began to study the projected advance, for I had ideas myself. We were to attack to the north of Lens, while the French attacked to the south. There was a gap of a few miles in between the 2 offenses, and it was hoped that between us we would be able to pinch out Lens and advance into the open country beyond. The whole success of the scheme, so far as I could see, depended upon whether we could reach open country behind the 2 organized trench lines before the Germans could bring up reserves. There would be local reserves on the spot, of course, but we ought to be capable of dealing with them. So I began to study railway maps. The railway system around Lens is rather complicated, for it is a mining district, and there are a good many branch lines and sidings. But Lens itself was an almost essential point for any reinforcements reaching either battlefield. From Lens they would march either towards Hulloch or towards Vimy as the situation demanded. There was no other railway except the 2 main lines leading into Lens, which could carry reinforcements on any scale. Now, these 2 lines formed a junction about a mile to the north of the village of Avion. If, therefore, that junction could be put out of action, even for 24 hours during the first day of the battle, then such an event might lead to decisive results. I put forward my idea to the chief, who was a man of imagination. Nevertheless, he was something of a pessimist. He said he didn't see how it could possibly be done, but he was quite willing for me to try. He gave me the fullest possible liberty to carry out the scheme, and promised his wholehearted help in its preparation. Nor did he let me down. My adventure actually started 3 weeks before the battle. We had taken a small group of prisoners in a subsidiary attack between La Bassée and Givenchy. As usual, I mingled with these prisoners, suitably uniformed. There was one man among them of about my own height, and not unlike me in face. What was far more important, he had an outstanding distinctive feature. His hair was so blonde as to be almost white. Some such characteristic was essential to my purpose. How do you recognize a man, not by his normalities, but by his abnormal characteristics? Immediately I saw him. I decided that he was my quarry. Consequently, although all the rest were reported as prisoners to the Germans, this particular man was not, and when other prisoners wrote to their families mentioning that Ernest Carlton was with them, their letters were held back for some weeks until my experiment had been completed, for I proposed to take over the identity of this man. I was going over to the German side as Ernest Carlton. For 3 weeks I lived with the man. I waxed confidential to him, and he talked freely in return. He had no suspicions. Why should he? Particularly since I conversed not on military questions, but personalities. He talked for hours on end about his family, about the girl who was waiting to marry him. He showed me her photograph, told me all details about her. He talked of his battalion, which officers were good, and which had a very mixed ancestry, dating back for several generations, in which cows and pigs played apparently a very important part. There was little, so it seemed, that I did not know about him. In fact, at the end of 3 weeks, almost literally, I was no longer Captain Bernard Newman, but was Private Soldier Ernest Carlton of the 138th Bavarian Regiment. Before I went into the prison camp, I had instructed Mason to prepare the remainder of the details of my scheme. How was I to get over the line? That was my difficulty. It might be possible at night to crawl over no man's land and gain the German trenches. Nevertheless, it was a very risky proceeding, for I was just as likely to be shot down by Germans as by English. Furthermore, it would not perhaps fit in with my plans. If I did actually reach the German line, having apparently escaped from the English, surely I would be sent direct to my unit, which would be no use to me at all. This I gave as the official reason for deciding against the scheme. Actually, I may as well confess it now. What really influenced me was the fact that I would be carrying 2 or 3 sticks of dynamite or other suitable explosive, and it needs no imagination to estimate what would happen if a stray shot should chance to strike my pack. I decided therefore to attempt an aeroplane landing behind the German line. It had been done before on 3 or 4 occasions when we had desired to land an intelligence agent, or shall I call him a spy, outright. The difficulty was the getting back by this same method, but Mason worked out a detailed scheme with a very keen young pilot of the Flying Corps, and was able to assure me that it stood a good chance of success. Timing was all important. As soon as I knew the exact day of the battle, I proposed to go over. Yet I did not intend to do any work on the junction until the night before the battle, otherwise the damage might easily be repaired before the critical point of the conflict had been reached. This then was my scheme. 3 or 4 days before the battle, I would be flown over and dropped behind the German line. My pilot had been on several observation flights, and reported that there was a good flat area a mile to the south of Bois Bernard, where he could land without difficulty, and which seemed to be well away from view. He also pointed out, for many of his kind were great believers in luck, that there might be an omen of good fortune in the name of the village. He of course would leave immediately, without stopping his engine, and I would drop at once into my new part. The landing, I need hardly say, must be accomplished at night, not an easy task in those days, with no ground flares to guide us, but he was a smart pilot. There was half a moon, and he was quite confident that he could do it. I would then be Ernest Karkeln, a German soldier just returning from leave to rejoin his unit. Were I challenged, immediately I had a story ready, that I had been put in the wrong train at Douai, and had found myself at Arras instead of Lens. My papers were in perfect order. Our intelligence staff had seen to that, for our forgery department was second to none. And as a final guarantee of my identity, I carried the actual papers of the real Karkeln, including the photograph of his girl Irma. I was quite ready to describe the charms of Irma to anyone who came along. The attack, at first dated for September 15th, was eventually postponed until September 25th. On the night of the 21st, I got into the aeroplane, and my pilot, flying very high, crossed the German lines. He went far beyond our destination before he came down, almost silently, for he had switched off his engine, towards the spot he had observed. Several times he swooped in great circles around the field. There was no sign of any life. The rising moon gave him sufficient light, and he chanced the landing. It was certainly bumpy. At first I thought that he must have broken his landing wheels, which would have been very awkward for him, as he would have been unable to take off. However, a hurried examination proved that there was nothing amiss. He gave me a handshake and a final whisper of good luck, and a minute later his airplane was again speeding through the sky, and there was I, an Englishman, but now in German, no longer on the English side, but on the German side. I felt excited but very confident. I could explain everything to everybody except my own regiment, because of course they were under the impression that I was lying dead beyond the German line. I was Private Ernest Karkeln, complete with abnormally blonde hair. I lay down in a wood until it was light, then stepped out boldly towards Lens. Why should I hide myself? Had not a German soldier a right to walk behind his own line? At Maricourt I was challenged by a military policeman. I showed him my papers and told him my story about having got the wrong train. He was perfectly satisfied and allowed me to proceed. Early in the afternoon I reached Lens. The first thing to do was to find some place where I could take shelter for a day or two. My leave, according to my papers, had not yet expired, so I had sufficient time to scout round and find out the potentialities of attack. I had been given the address of 3 civilians who were acting as British or French agents in Lens, yet I hesitated to declare myself to them, because a false word would have ruined my plans. In any case, I was never so certain about the integrity of these civilian agents as were some of our staff officers. I did walk around, however, and have a look at the 3 houses, and when I found that one of them was an estaminet in which 8 or 10 German soldiers were sitting drinking, I had no hesitation in entering. Even then, however, I gave no hint as to my identity or purpose. All I did was to ask the fat old lady behind the bar if she could recommend some house where I might stay for the night. I pointed out that my leave had not yet expired, and who wanted to return to the trenches a day before they need do so. I wanted a place, I said, where I could rest and be quiet. I emphasized the quietness.